This is Pastor Jeff Kelley, inviting you to join me for Gleanings of Grace, a ministry of Grace Baptist Church in Liberty, South Carolina. Situated in the foothills of the upstate of South Carolina, Grace Baptist Church is centrally located between Greenville and Clemson. If you live within driving distance, or if you should be visiting our area, we extend a personal invitation for you to worship with us. You will find a warm and friendly congregation where visitors are welcome. You can learn more about our church or contact us at gracebaptistchurchsc.org. The text before us is the story of Jesus walking on the water to the disciples in the midst of the storm. It's obvious from the reading of that text. If you're familiar with the context, what has immediately happened just before this story, you're very much aware that Jesus has just fed the 5,000 plus with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And the disciples are put in a boat by Jesus and instructed to go to the other side of the sea. It's not abundantly clear from this text here before us, but the idea is certainly that it would seem that he planned to meet them. That Jesus in verse 22 constrains them to get into the ship and to go before him. That is, it would seem to suggest that he is saying, I'll meet you there. And in doing so, these disciples encounter a storm on the Sea of Galilee. It's not uncommon for storms to occur on the Sea of Galilee. In fact, those who have studied this or understand this particular region suggest that because of the nature or the manner in which the land is shaped in that particular region, that storms are a very common thing on the Sea of Galilee. This is not likely the first storm they had encountered, but it was certainly a different storm. And this text is a wonderful text, and we often think of it in light of Peter walking on the water. And it's a wonderful text for us to contemplate that. It's a wonderful text for us to learn what Peter learned in this moment of trouble, and how he learned to trust the Lord and to rely on the Lord even when he was doing something quite miraculous. And while I think that's an important part of this text, I'm interested in a broader aspect of this particular text for us this morning. We know the story is the story of Peter walking on the water, and I don't want to minimize that because he still holds the world's record, other than Christ, for having been the only one to do that. But this storm, I think, also teaches us something, or this story rather, teaches us something about what storms are like for the people of God, and its impact or its significance for us from the relationship to us spiritually. Storms are often used metaphorically to identify or to represent trouble in one's life. Medically, they refer to certain aspects, as I understand it, of physical problems as a storm. In particular, I'm familiar with what is referred to as a thyroid storm. You can have a storm physically in your life. Oftentimes, we might be more inclined to associate a storm in our life with an emotional storm. We go through a troubling time when our feet hardly feel as if they are on firm ground, and we don't know which end is up, and we're confused and we're befuddled. Someone has observed that everyone in life is encountering or facing storms. They suggest that you are either currently in the midst of a storm, if not you're currently in the midst of a storm, you've just recently come out of a storm, or what we might fear the most, we're about ready to enter into a new storm. No one likes to face a storm alone. In a moment of storm, we want someone to be near. We look to someone to our left or to our right to help us, to speak a word of comfort, to tell us it's going to be okay, to maybe sometimes just to verify that what we are seeing and what we are experiencing is really what is going on, that I'm not crazy, I'm not misreading this. This is really what's happening. We don't want to be alone. We are really looking for comfort. We're looking for cheer. We're looking for someone to say there's no need to be afraid in the moment of our storm. And I'm interested this morning in this passage of Scripture and seeing it from that perspective. Because this particular storm would seem to have left the disciples alone. Now, that might seem contradictory because the disciples were there together. So in a sense, they were not alone. But as a group of people, this little group is alone as far as Jesus is concerned. Jesus has put them in a boat. He sent them on. He's going to do something else. They are in trouble. And as a group, they are facing a storm on the Sea of Galilee. But I would suggest to you that they are very far from being alone in this storm. That Jesus is much more near, much more close, much nearer to them than even they imagine. And so this morning, I want us to glean a few thoughts with the Lord's help, with this thought in mind, with Jesus in the storm. What is it like to be in the storm with Jesus? And I would also like to make it clear as we work our way through this text that while it might appear that Jesus is absent from them in this storm, He is very much near. And the word of encouragement to us today is simply this, that when it would seem as if Jesus is far away from us in our storm, He is much nearer than we suppose Him to be. When I look at this text, I see three words that are found right here in the text that I think speak to us of what this passage can teach us. The first word is found in verse number 22. And straightway Jesus, we are told, constrained His disciples. He constrained them. When I read that, I get the sense of almost having to make them. He had to argue with them a little bit. I can imagine someone like Peter saying to Jesus, well, Lord, what are you going to do? And who knows what Jesus' answer may have been. It could have been a simple, well, don't worry about that, Peter. I've got things to do. And maybe he could have said, well, Peter, I'm going to go pray for a while. He could have answered Peter in any number of ways, but I can imagine Peter responded with, but I want to go with you. Jesus said, no, Peter, get in the boat. But Lord, all these people, you know how it is. You can't go anywhere without getting thronged with people. You need somebody with you to help you. No, Peter, just get in the boat. Maybe there were some, like doubting Thomas in the group who just kind of went on, well, sure, whatever, But there were certainly some. He had to constrain them. He had to argue with them a little bit. He had to press them to get in the boat. That is, He sent them in a place or in a direction or on a course that they themselves were not necessarily inclined to go. I don't think that's because they necessarily said, we're going to hit a storm and we're going to need you. No, they didn't understand what lay before them. But they knew that there was some reason they wanted to go with Jesus. And you and I are often the same way. We love those verses, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And if we had the notion or the idea that the Lord was going to send us on in some way, we would say, but Lord, we need you with us. We want you to go with us. And oftentimes we don't understand why He sends us where He sends us. And we have to trust Him that He knows what's best. And our text says that He constrained them to go before Him. And a few words later He said, while He. Jesus is urging them to go on to the other side. And He is sending away the multitudes. Ultimately, He is going to be found alone in prayer. And Jesus sent them before. On the morning of the resurrection, I'm reminded that Jesus told the women who came to the grave, He told them, "Go tell my disciples that I will meet them in Galilee." He sent the disciples on to Galilee. The Lord seems to send us on ahead of Him. There are times when it would seem as if the Lord has pulled apart, if you will, to pray, as our text says. He sent them on before Him. Wow, He sent away the multitudes. But when He had sent the multitudes away, He went up in a mountain apart to pray. And you know, most of us would say, well, I'd rather be at the prayer meeting with Jesus. We'd rather be a part of the ministry, sending the multitudes away. We want to go with Christ. We want to go where it would seem He's going. And sometimes He sends us on a course or in a path, in a direction that we don't necessarily understand. The text says also that He was there alone. At the end of verse number 23. He went up into a mountain apart to pray, and when the evening was come, He was there alone. This is where I think this text is profoundly important for us to understand. Because while the text says that He was there alone, it does not indicate that they were there alone. In fact, it would seem to be just the opposite. Because Mark in his gospel, in telling this story, makes it clear to us that while He was alone praying, He saw them toiling and rowing. In the midst of this storm, when they are apart from Christ, they would have rather been in ministry with Him, they would have rather been in the prayer meeting with Him, they would, quite frankly, have probably taken a great sense of pride in knowing that they were keeping Jesus from being Himself alone. Jesus is actually with them. His eyes are on them. Remember the passage of Scripture that says, the eyes of the Lord run to and fro to show that He might show Himself strong in behalf of those who trust in Him. He knew where these disciples were, and they were not alone. He constrained them to go to the other side. I draw your attention, secondly, this morning, in verse number 24, to a word that I think speaks to us from this text. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. The first word we noticed in verse number 22 is the word constrained. The second word we notice is this word contrary. I would dare say that all of us have experienced what it means to encounter a storm in life. For some, it might seem, in others' opinions, to be a rather small storm. Not a very big storm, just a summer shower, if you will, that kind of rains on our parade. For others, it may seem to have been a hurricane that blows everything away that's not nailed down, and even then blows away some of that. And we understand to some extent, maybe in small ways and others in larger ways, what it is to experience a contrariness in life. When the storms of life are contrary, when nothing seems to work. We often, someone has, you might could argue in a sense, dubbed it Murphy's Law. We've all heard of Murphy's Law. You know, if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. And all these little, sayings that reflect what it's like to have things just not work out right. The whole concept that nothing is working, everything is against us, nothing is going our way. Every day seems to be, in the world's perspective, a Monday. And nothing is going the way it ought to go. And these disciples are experiencing contrary winds, and the winds are stirring up the waves. There's three phrases in this text that illustrate what these contrary winds did to them and what the contrary winds of life will do to us. You'll notice the statement is made here that they are in the midst of the sea. There is no getting out of this storm. As I was pondering this text, I was thinking about the fact that had they been close to land, they might have tried to make it to shore. They might have tried to walk their way in. They might have tried in some cases to swim their way in. You remember Paul and those who were with him in Acts chapter 27 and the great storm that Paul encountered. When they got so close to land, Paul instructed them that those who could swim to land. If you can't swim, grab a board or a plank. The ship's coming apart and float to land. Just commit yourself to the sea, and Paul had confidence from a word from God that they were going to make it safely to land. But from man's perspective, it would seem, commit yourself to the storm and just hope you can make it. They were in the midst of the sea. And there are times we find ourselves in life when we are in the midst of a sea and there's a storm brewing. If we could just get close to land, we might go overboard and try to swim our way to shore. But you can't do it from here. There's no hope. There's nothing we can do. They are in the midst of the sea. They are tossed with the waves. It's completely out of their control. I mean, if you're on a boat, there's not anything you can do. When you're in a boat, you're going to rock with the waves. And if the sea is smooth and calm, well, you may enjoy a nice, wonderful ride on the sea. But if the waves begin to stir, you're going to experience a very choppy, tumultuous ride in that boat. If you've ever found yourself, thankfully I've never found myself in extremely bad weather on the sea, but what I've experienced, which is nowhere near a storm on the sea, is plenty enough to tell me I don't want to be there when it gets like that. You see some of these pictures of boats who find themselves in deep waves and how the boat is rocked and turned and shifted in every way. There's no way to stand. I mean, there's nothing you could do. And sometimes life leaves us in positions and in ways where, quite frankly, there's nothing we could do. We put our feet on what we think to be firm ground and the boat shifts under us. Another wave hits our boat and knocks us in a different direction. And as the psalmist said, of those who go into the depths of the sea, we find ourselves at our wits' end, reeling. We find them not only in the midst of the sea, no capability of fixing their problem. They are tossed with the waves, no control over their circumstances, but they are gripped with fear. The last thing you want in a moment like this, when you don't have any control over your circumstances, and you can't seem to do anything about it, and you're tossed in the waves, and every crash of the wave seems to send you in a different direction. The last thing in the world you want to see is something else to add to your fear. And these disciples see Jesus walking on the sea, and they are troubled, and they say, "It is a spirit," and they cried out for fear. In the midst of all this trouble, they see what they perceive to be is a spirit. Here's someone else to cause us trouble. I think this is telling. These men had been on this sea before. They knew what these storms were like. They understood these things. But now they encounter even more to this that causes them to cry out, to scream. Brave, tough fishermen screaming in fear. But can I suggest to us that the Lord isn't, I don't think, teaching us this just to say, well, this is the way life is going to be. No, He constrains us sometimes to go in a way that we don't understand. putting us in a path where the winds are contrary in our life and we have what would seem to be absolutely no control over our circumstances. And in the midst of all of that fear, something else arises on the scene that causes us to cry out in fear. And that's where we find the third word that I think is significant for us to understand. It's found in verse number 27. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid. The word cheer. That's what these disciples need. A word to cheer them up. Now, you know what I find really interesting? The disciples look out of the boat and they say, It is a spirit. And they cry out with fear. Jesus hears their cry. And he says, Be of good cheer. It is I. They said, It's a spirit. Jesus says, No, it's me. It's me. Be not afraid. Do you realize how Jesus' answer to them in this storm is the answer to exactly what their question is? It's a spirit. And Jesus says, No, it's just me. And they cry with fear. And Jesus says, Don't be afraid. There's no need to fear. And can I suggest to you that in the midst of our storms, when the winds are contrary, when the waves are lashing our boat, when we can't seem to find firm footing for our feet, it is in those moments, crying out in fear, that we can. The Lord wants us to hear Him say, It's me. And there's no reason for you to be afraid. Be of good cheer. He speaks a word of comfort in verse 27. Be of good cheer. Cheer up. Now, most of us would say, cheer up, it'll get better or it'll get worse. You know, as one person said, there's not much you can do about it. Well, that's true from one standpoint. I can't change my circumstances, but I know one who can. And you know, the reality of it is that it isn't necessarily my circumstances that need to be changed. It's me who needs to hear God say, Be of good cheer. You know, isn't it absolutely amazing that we can in moments of great fear just have what would seem to be the sweetest peace roll over our soul. That's why I love coming to church, because oftentimes we'll come in and we may be discouraged and we may be down. We may feel like we've been fighting the devil all week. We may feel as if everything is going against us. The waves are lashing against the side of our boat and leaving us at our wits' end. And we could come in and we could start singing the songs of Zion. We could start singing songs about faith. My faith has found a resting place. Or we can sing, Oh, safe to the rock that is higher than I. And in a matter of a few moments, it seems like the waves begin to still. Or maybe in some ways it almost feels like we found a place, a shelter, if you will, as the songwriter said, in the time of the storm. It's not that we look out and we say, well, the winds have quit blowing and the waves have quit beating against my soul. No, I've just found a shelter in the time of my storm. That's what the Lord is saying to the disciples. Be of good cheer. There's a word of encouragement. Peter said in verse number 28, If it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. Now, you know what's amazing? This is the amazing thing. We can be as scared as it's possible for us to be in our Christian life. And the peace of God can just roll over our soul. And it's a wonderful thing, because in that moment, I think sometimes we're all a little bit like Peter. You know, most people look at Peter and go, I'd have been staying in a boat. There's no way. But I think there's a sense in which we're all tempted to be like Peter. Not that it's a bad thing. Because here's what happened. When Peter heard the Lord say, It's me, Be of good cheer. Peter no longer seems to be concerned about the waves. He no longer seems to be concerned about the wind. He simply says, well, if it's you, I ought to be able to walk to you. These winds and these waves shouldn't bother me. Bid me come. And how many times in the moments of our greatest distress, when we hear the Lord say, it's me, we feel like we can take on the world. What was the preacher said? He felt like he could charge hell with a water gun. We feel like we can take on the world. And amazingly, the Lord will say, well, come. Come. It's a word of encouragement. You can walk on the water in your storm. Someone has suggested that you can't walk on the water until you get out of the boat. And that's true. But can I suggest to you that it is really not safe to get out of the boat until you hear the Lord say, come. But in the midst of our storm, when it seems everything is against us, we can hear the Lord say, come on. There's not only a word of comfort, there's a word of encouragement. There's a word of rebuke in verse 31. Peter begins to sink. And he cries out, Lord, save me. Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Sometimes even in the midst of the storm, when for a moment we seem to forget the winds and the waves and we step out to walk to Jesus, we suddenly lose our focus. There's a number of different reasons. You know, we can find 1,000 different reasons, I suppose, to criticize Peter. We're all guilty of every one of them. Maybe Peter turned around and looked at his brother Andrew and said, hey, look what I'm doing, and realized the wind was blowing and the waves were all around him. Maybe Peter's just really excited about what's going on. Maybe all of us, everybody said he got his eyes off Jesus. True. Peter doubted. Even in the moments of our greatest faith, we find elements of doubt. And the Lord is saying to us, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? And you know, it is good for us to hear the rebuke of the Lord even in the moments of our greatest faith. And I would just suggest to you that I think it's important that we see the order in which this happens. The Lord says, it is I, be of good cheer. He cheers our heart while the winds are still blowing. He says to us, be not afraid, that He might calm our hearts. And it's after that it seems the Lord calms the storm. He's not so much about changing the storm until He's first changed our hearts. Which leads me to the conclusion this morning, and just very briefly, I want to drive home one principle or one truth. Verse number 33, they came and worshiped Him and said, of a truth, Thou art the Son of God. It was not that they were awed by what Peter had accomplished, but they are awed because they have a new understanding of who Jesus is. And isn't it a wonderful thing that when the Lord sends us on into the path of a storm, meets us in our storm, we think we know all there is to know about Jesus. And suddenly, we discover there's more than we ever knew. And we find ourselves on our face before Him, worshiping Him.
You've been listening to Gleanings of Grace, a ministry of Grace Baptist Church in Liberty, South Carolina. We invite you to correspond with us by writing to Grace Baptist Church, Post Office Box 1454, Easley, South Carolina 29641. You may also contact us or learn more about the church by visiting gracebaptistchurchsc.org.